In the early years of the space race, the American approach to it was very practical. They knew it was not advisable to use rockets to go to space as it is very expensive and a complex undertaking. They knew that even if the rocket is the only way to go, using a very big rocket which will be discarded completely every time it is launched is still not the way to go. They predicted that if the same approach will be taken, they might reach the moon, but they won't be able to keep it. But something happened on 4th of October 1957 which changed it all. Sputnik, the Russian satellite, was launched in the Earth orbit, and thus Americans had to throw everything out of the window and keep their heads down and proceed to the space race, which Russians were winning at an alarming rate. So the inefficient rocket approach was taken, which was the fastest route to the moon, and the rest is history. But soon after they had achieved this feat and Russians effectively out of the space race, the NASA's budget was cut and NASA could not fly the last 3 moon missions, thus ending the Apollo mission at Apollo 17. After that, NASA came up with a plan which will give an easy access to the space at low cost. Thus, the Space Shuttle story began. Its missions involved carrying large payloads to various orbits, including segments to be added to the International Space Station, providing crew rotation for the space station, and performing service missions on the Hubble Space Telescope. The orbiter also recovered satellites and other payloads from the orbit and returned them to the Earth. Now that was really spooky, especially to the Russians. The space shuttle composed of an orbiter launched with 2 reusable solid rocket boosters and a disposable external fuel tank, carried up to 8 astronauts and up to 23,000 kg of payload into lower Earth orbit. When its mission was complete, the orbiter would re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and land like a glider at either the Kennedy Space Center or Edwards Air Force Base, again like a glider, not a powered aeroplane. Well, in itself the space shuttle was an engineering marvel, but did it live up to its expectations for an easy access to the space is still debatable, because it did make 135 missions, but the operating cost was too high, leading to an overall cost in billions. The shuttle was originally conceived to operate somewhat like an airliner. After landing, the orbiter would be checked out and start being mated to the external tank and the solid rocket boosters, and be ready for launch in as little as 2 weeks. In actual service, this turnaround processes usually take months. Secondly, the accidents also raised safety concerns and management issues for NASA. While the technical details of Challenger and Columbia accidents are different, the organizational problems show similarities. Flight engineers' concerns about possible problems were not properly communicated to or understood by the senior NASA managers. The vehicle gave ample amount of warning beforehand of the abnormal problems it was going through. The Challenger accident happened due to the erosion of O-rings in the side rocket boosters, while the Columbia accident happened due to the damaged thermal protection from the foam debris that broke off from the external fuel tank. Over time, NASA managers gradually accepted mortal damage similar to how they accepted the O-ring damage. This tendency was called normalization of deviance, a gradual acceptance of events outside the design tolerances of the craft, simply because they had not been catastrophic to date. Over the span of 30 years and 135 space missions, it was concluded that the incremental cost per flight of the space shuttle was estimated at around $450 million, or simply put 18,000 per kilogram. By comparison, Russian proton expendable cargo launchers, still largely based on the design that dates back to 1965, are said to cost as little as $110 million, or around $5,000 per kg. In 2004, aftermath of Columbia disaster, it was formally scheduled for a mandatory retirement in 2010, in accord with the directives of Vision for Space Exploration. And thus the last space shuttle to fly was Atlantis, which launched on 8 July 2011 and landed on 21st July 2011, which marked the end of the space shuttle era.